I love a good story. Anybody who knows me knows that I love a good movie. I love a good TV series, especially with good writing. A good storyline to me grabs my attention, and it's even better if it has a lot of layers to it. So the more layers, the better. I love that. If a good story has things like family dysfunction, brother against brother, son against father, hardship, resentment, money, power, struggle, greed, vice, shame, love, joy. You put all those things into a good story, that's going to be interesting and compelling. And if you can get your listener or your hearer or the viewer to relate themselves to one of the characters in the story, you're doing even better. You're drawing them in. I love that kind of story. And if you can throw in a few plot twists that you never see coming, and if you throw in a giant cliffhanger at the end, now that would be genius level storytelling. And that is exactly the storytelling we see this morning in Luke 15 with Jesus. So go ahead and pull up or turn over to Luke 15. We're going to be talking in verses 11 through 32 primarily. The title of this story this morning is The Parable of the Prodigal Son. I'm not a fan of that title. I'll explain why later, but for now, we'll just call it The Parable of the Prodigal Son. But before we get into that, I need you to see the context. Luke 15, let's start there in verse 1. I'll turn there with you. Luke 15, verse 1, there are a lot of people hanging out and around Jesus. There's a lot of crowds following him at this point in his ministry. And here we see in verse 1 of chapter 15, the crowd that's going to hear the story we're talking about today. Now, all the tax collectors and sinners were coming near to Jesus to listen to him. And both the Pharisees and the scribes began to complain, saying, "This man receives sinners and eats with them." And so he told them this parable. We'll stop right there for a second. We need to understand who's in the audience today. So in the audience here, we have tax collectors and sinners. In other places, similar stories, Jesus talks about tax collectors and prostitutes, sometimes tax collectors and sinners. These are not the high part of society, okay? These are the people that are typically looked down upon, people who are typically outcast with their lifestyles and the choices that they've made. These are the people, half the group that's there are the tax collectors and the sinners. The other group is made up of Pharisees and scribes. Now, who are those folks? Well, the Pharisees were a pretty large group of Judaism, and their job was to protect the sanctity and righteousness of Judaism. There were 613 commandments in Torah. The Torah is the first 5 books of the Old Testament: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. The Pharisees knew Torah backwards and forwards. They had to understand the 613 commands so that they could enforce them. And then, of course, they added a bunch more on their own. But they had to know those. So that's the Pharisees. How about the scribes? Well, the scribes, their job was to copy Torah. Their job was to be intimately familiar with Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, backwards and forwards, every brushstroke, every letter. They had to be meticulous and exact in how they copied Torah so there were no errors in it. So the Pharisees and scribes were intimately familiar with the first 5 books of the Old Testament. I'm drilling on that for a second because that's going to be really important to what's coming later. Well, let's see what they're doing as they're listening to the genius master storyteller here. The tax collectors and sinners were coming near Jesus to listen to him. The word that Luke uses here for listen is the Greek word for to hear from him. There's a Greek translation of the Old Testament called the Septuagint, and in the Septuagint, the word here that Luke uses for hear is the word that's used in Deuteronomy 6:4 for the most important prayer in all of Judaism that they will pray a couple times a day. It's called the Shema. The reason it's called the Shema is because Shema is the first word in Hebrew of the prayer. Shema Yisrael. Hear, O Israel, the Lord, our God, the Lord is one. So the same word for hear that's used in the Shema is the same word for hear that's used to describe the tax collectors and the sinners. So the people who are typically outcast from God are the ones who are leaning in to hear from God in this moment. All right? Let's see what the Pharisees and scribes were doing in this moment. Oh, they began to complain. Okay. Well, the word complain that Luke uses here is the same Greek word that the Septuagint in Exodus translates for the children of Israel grumbling and complaining in the wilderness. So this already, for somebody who's watching and reading this story, not their live, but reading this story, is already seeing an inversion of what they would expect. The people who are typically deemed far away from God are the ones hearing from God, listening, and the ones who should be really, really close to God are the ones grumbling and not paying attention, and they're rebelling through their grumbling against God. This is not what the reader would have expected to see. And what's about to happen is not what the live audience there that day would have expected either. All right. If you look, we're not going to read the whole thing, but there's two other stories before the quote-unquote prodigal son. Really, if you want to think about it, this is really, I would call it a meta parable, okay? There are three stories here. There's the story of the sheep and the coin and the prodigal son. There's three stories. I would say that those are all one parable. So you have this meta parable, and you have two stories leading up to it, and we got to at least touch on them before we get into the one that we're going to focus on, because if you don't, you're not really going to fully understand the last story. So the first story is the parable of the lost sheep. In the parable of the lost sheep, there are 100 sheep, and the shepherd finds out that one of them is lost. One of them has gone away. One of them has run off out of the pasture far away. So the shepherd goes and searches for that lost sheep, finds the lost sheep, brings it back, tells everybody around. There's a big celebration. They have a banquet, and that's the story. So it starts out with 100. Then he moves on, Jesus moves on in telling the story of 10, the coins. And there's this woman who loses a coin, one of the 10, probably from a wedding headband or a necklace, something they would wear on their wedding day and then wear throughout their life. She has lost one of the coins. One of the coins is lost in her house. And so she puts a light on it and sweeps and sweeps and sweeps until she finds the lost coin. When she finds the lost coin, she tells her friends, they get together, they have a celebration, they have a banquet. That's story number 2. Story number 1, where was the sheep lost? At home or far away? Far away. Story number 2, where was the coin lost? At home or far away? At home. So we've heard a story of something lost far away. We've heard a story of something lost at home. Don't think Jesus was accidentally telling this story. Now we get into the story of what people typically call the prodigal son. But let's start in verse 11. We'll just kind of read through it, dig through it, and talk about it. And he said, verse 11 of chapter 15, a man had 2 sons. The younger of them said to his father, Father, give me the share of the estate that's coming to me. And so he divided his wealth between them. We have a story that's gone from 100 to 10 to 2. Jesus is tightening the net. He's drawing it in and getting the focus clearer and clearer. We see these 2 sons. The younger one, he's an interesting fellow. That's the one history typically focuses on. I'm not sure that's the one Jesus was focusing on, but anyway. The younger one said to the father, give me the share of the estate that's coming to me. Basically, saying this and demanding the inheritance while the father was still alive was tantamount to saying, I wish you were dead. I wish you were dead, because then I'd get the stuff that's coming to me. Wow. That's what he's saying. You know, there's something interesting here, and we'll have a really, really short tech moment. But when it says the father, the share of the estate, and the father divided the wealth between them, the word for wealth there is an interesting Greek word. It's a root word of bios. Bios is the Greek word for wealth here, and basically it means the things in his life that make his wealth happen, that make his life and his lifestyle happen. It connects everything and makes it all work together properly. See, well, how is that a tech moment? Look, anybody who works in IT and tech knows the term BIOS, Basic Input-Output System. The BIOS is the software that connects the operating system, without getting too technical, with all the hardware pieces in the computer to make it all work together and function properly. Listen, the tech folks are pretty savvy. I don't think that's accident. BIOS, they chose that as their acronym. Look, I don't think that's an accident, but that's it for the tech moment. We'll move on. I just love that because my son's in tech, and so it interests me. I tell you, but I don't think that's accidental. I don't think that's accidental. All right, so he divides his wealth between them. And what's interesting about dividing the wealth, in Jewish law, and we won't go into the Old Testament scriptures about it, but in Jewish law, the older son would have gotten a double portion, okay? So basically, this would have been a third and two-thirds. So the younger son would have gotten a third of the estate, and the older son would have gotten two-thirds. Now, father's still alive. They're still going to be living. They live on a farm, so how's that going to work? Well, probably the younger son, the father probably had to liquidate just about anything that wasn't nailed down to provide that share to him. And if that still didn't get it, probably had to liquidate a little bit of the land. But the son, the older son, probably got all the land and the buildings. That was his two-thirds. That was his share. He gave it to both. He loved both sons. But the younger son has now received his third of the inheritance, wishing his father were dead, basically. And at this point, the audience is probably listening, wondering, what's he going to do with it? Well, they don't have to wait very long. Don't have to wait very long. Look at verse 13. And not many days later, the younger son gathered everything together and went on a journey to a distant country, and there he squandered his estate in wild living. Now, it's kind of interesting. We'll take a look at some of the words that Luke uses here that Jesus mentioned here as he's telling this story. The word for squander, when he squandered the estate, the word for squander is kind of like where you would scatter or disperse something like seed randomly, wastefully, not intentionally, not carefully. In the recent past, we might say that this is the equivalent of sowing his wild oats. Okay, that's how we might say it today. That's what he's saying here, squandered the wealth. He's sowing his wild oats. And in wild living, the word wild there that Luke uses is basically, Jesus doesn't go into detail, but basically that word back then meant that highly immoral, shameful behavior. So this guy is just throwing money, it's burning a hole in his pocket, he's throwing it away left and right, going through it like water. And then we move on to verse 14. Now, when he had spent everything, well, that didn't take long, a severe famine occurred in that country, and he began doing without. So he went and hired himself out to one of the citizens of that country, and he sent them into his fields to feed the pigs. And he longed to have his fill of the carob pods that the pigs were eating, and no one was giving him anything. Now this guy's in trouble. He spent all the money, so now he is without any means of support for himself. The word there in verse 15, he hired himself out to one of the citizens, is literally a Greek word for he glued himself to this individual. He had to have a place to at least have a chance at surviving. He had run out of food, and there was a famine. Not a famine in his home country, not a famine in some other country, a famine in that country where he was. So now he's run out of his inheritance. He's run out of food. There's a famine in the land, and he's just trying to find a safe place to sleep at night. He glues himself to this guy who sends him out into the fields to shepherd the pigs. And he longs to have the food that the pigs are eating. And what do we see they're eating there? They're eating the carob pods, and no one was giving him anything. This guy is being looked down upon because of his wild living. The audience would have kind of looked down upon him for his wild living. The Pharisees and scribes certainly would have. And he had become a shepherd. Shepherds were not highly regarded back in that day. I think it's one of the reasons why the angels came and told the shepherds the night Jesus was born. So he's looked down upon probably because he's a shepherd in this story. And then he's also looked down upon because there's pigs involved. Pigs are unclean in Judaism. He's looked down upon, looked down upon, looked down upon, and he's close to death. He's struggling. You say, well, if you're interested, what is a carob pod? Well, I'll tell you. So a couple of years ago, we took a group to Israel, and in the northeast Jezreel Valley, we came upon a grove of carob trees. They're a tall evergreen tree, and these pods are about a little bit bigger than that, and they look like bean pods. And you can eat them. And I will say this, some of the members of the Israel team picked them off the tree and ate them. I will not, it may have been some people even in this room. I will not call you out, but you know who you are. This was food that was typically for fattening pigs up, and it was food that poor people ate. So this guy can't even eat the food that the pigs are eating and that poor people eat. He's in desperate trouble. And now we see in verse 17, he has hit rock bottom. But when he came to his senses, he said, "How many of my father's hired laborers have more than enough bread, but I am dying here of hunger? I'll set out and go to my father, and I'll say to him, 'Father, I've sinned against heaven and in your sight. I'm no longer worthy to be called your son. Treat me as one of your hired laborers.'" This is where the redemption arc starts. He has to acknowledge his unworthiness. I mean, the Pharisees, listening to this story, the Pharisees' lives and scribes' lives were built upon their self-worth, how they saw themselves. It was all about self-righteousness and self-worth. And so for this guy to admit he's unworthy would have been a big deal, because earning your place in God's kingdom was what the Pharisees were all about. The word hired laborer that he uses here, the younger son, says, look, he rehearses this speech. I mean, this is a very well thought out speech, and he's got it planned, and I'm sure he's going through it, running through it, how he's going to deliver it. And he says, I want to be like one of your hired laborers there in verse 19. So what's a hired laborer? What would he have been talking about in the agricultural social structure? All right, so there were basically four layers. There's the family layer, and then there are the servants who were working in household affairs, and then there are the servants who are the hired hands out in the fields, and then there were the hired laborers. These are basically the day laborers who would be paid day to day, wouldn't necessarily get fed, and there was no guarantee of future employment. So he's saying, look, I'm not even asking to be part of the family. I'm not asking to be close to the home. I'm just happy to be on the property. And if you can use me that day, use me. He is broken. He is unworthy. And he's at rock bottom, and he comes to his senses. No excuses. I don't see anywhere here in 17 through 19 that he tries to make an excuse about anything. And that's what we do a lot of times today, right? We try to make excuses and justify, well, I did that because. He's owning it. There's no excuse here. He says, look, I was wrong. Let's look at verse 20. So he set out and came to his father. But when he was still a long way off, his father saw him and felt compassion for him and ran and embraced him and kissed him. And the son said to him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and in your sight. I'm no longer worthy to be called your son. Let's stop right there for a second. This would have been an unexpected father response. The Pharisees and scribes would not have expected this response from the father, because after all, the son had left. He's a worthless son. He rebelled against the family. He rebelled against the father. But the father here, it says, felt compassion for his son. The term we would use for that today is from the bottom of his heart. He felt for his son. And when it says that the father ran to him, watching for him, and embraced him, embraced him, there in verse 20, and kissed him. The word for embrace is the word like he gave him a big old bear hug. So he's looking for him, ran to him, which was a little bit undignified, but he did it. It's his boy. Boy's coming home. Ran to him, embraced him, gave him a big old bear hug, and kissed him. This would not have been the response the Pharisees and scribes would have expected. And the son, remember, that's the first half of the speech, but that's when the father gets there and crashes into him, and the son doesn't even get to finish the speech. He doesn't get to finish. Look at verse 22. But the father said to his slaves, quickly, bring out the best robe and put it on him, and put a ring on his finger and sandals on his feet, and bring the fattened calf, slaughter it, and let's eat and celebrate. For this son of mine was dead and has come to life again. He was lost and has been found. And they began to celebrate. It's interesting in this story, we never see the father speaking to the younger son. You can fact check me. It's not in there. The father never speaks to the younger son. The father speaks to the older brother. We'll see that. The father speaks to the servants, but he never speaks to the younger son because, I believe, actions speak louder than words. He didn't need to say anything to his son. He ran to him, embraced him, and kissed him. He's received back. Talked about killing and slaughtering the fattened calf. There typically would be one fattened calf that was being prepared for a feast at any time. So you would only keep one, but that poor calf had to know its days were numbered, because as soon as the first celebration hits, he's gone. But the fattened calf was slaughtered, and he says to the servants, quickly, immediately, get the best robe. In Greek, word order matters. Okay? Word order matters a lot. The more important the word, the closer it typically is to the first of the sentence. So in this word, in Greek, the first word is quickly. Immediately, the father goes into action. Quickly, immediately get a robe, a ring, and sandals on this boy. And he says, what kind of robe? The best robe. Now, that's the word we get, the Greek word protos. So it's kind of the proto-robe, the robe that all the other robes wish they were. This is where we also get the word prototype, the first of its kind. So the proto-robe is what he's asking for here. And this would have been scandalous to the Pharisees and scribes, because you're giving the best robe to a sinner. Well, Jesus knew that the Pharisees loved the proto-robes. They loved the best robes, and actually we're going to see that here in Luke 20. Let me turn over to Luke 20 for a second. Luke 20, verse 46. Jesus talking. Beware of the scribes who like to walk around in long robes. These are those kind of robes. and love personal greetings in the marketplaces, and chief seats in the synagogues and places of honor at banquets, who devour widows' houses and for appearance sake offer long prayers. These will receive all the more condemnation. This story that Jesus is telling is scandalous to the scribes and Pharisees. You can almost see the steam coming up in their head. They're getting mad about this. They're getting fired up about this. The best robe goes to the ginormous sinner. In Luke 20, we just read the banquet that they're invited to. They love the best seats there, and the synagogue too. But here we see a banquet being prepared for the younger brother. In Jesus' talk, in parables and stories, a lot of times banquets equated to the kingdom. And so what he's saying here is that this younger brother is in the kingdom. He's getting celebrated in the kingdom here. What Jesus is saying to the tax collectors and sinners and scribes and Pharisees is that anyone can turn to God and make it in. The younger brother received all the blessings, but he had done nothing to earn it. It's kind of the point Jesus is making here. So put yourself in the sandals of a scribe and Pharisee there in that time. If you're one of those two groups, you haven't yet identified yourself with anybody in the story. And you're probably wondering, well, when's he going to talk? When's he going to talk about us? You're about to find out. Right here in verse 25. Now his older son was in the field, and when he came and approached the house, he heard music and dancing. And he summoned one of the servants and began inquiring what these things could be. And he said to him, "Your brother has come, and your father has slaughtered the fattened calf because he has received him back safe and sound." But he became angry and was not willing to go in. And his father came out and began pleading with him. We'll stop right there for a second. Older bro, throw a man fit. This is ugly. He's not going in at all. He's out there pouting in the field. He's throwing a big man fit. Anyone can turn to God and make it. The older brother's not having it for the younger brother there. How in the world, the older brother is thinking, how in the world can they celebrate without me? I deserve that. He stays in the field, big mad, because he's focused on what he's not getting, not on what the younger brother's receiving. He's focused on what he's not getting. And the father begs him to come in. Let's see what the response is. But he, the older son, answered and said to his father, "Look, for so many years I've been serving you, and I have never neglected a command of yours, and yet you never gave me a young goat so that I might celebrate with my friends. But when this son of yours came, who has devoured your wealth with prostitutes, you slaughtered the fattened calf for him." He goes off on his dad. It's not even pretty. He doesn't even try to be nice. He goes off on his dad. When he says serving, the term there is literally, I've been slaving for you for years. I slaved for you for years. I never disobeyed a command you gave. I have never disobeyed you. Now, come on, bro. You might be stretching it a little bit to make your point to the next level, but never disobeyed Dad. But that's what he says. He says, you never gave me a goat to enjoy at the banquet at a celebration. Now, some of you are like, well, that wouldn't bother me. Hey, listen, if you ever had, one of my favorite Tex-Mex dishes is goat tacos, Chivo tacos. Don't groan about it until you tried it. It's actually pretty good, pretty good. But he never gave him a goat to enjoy at a banquet or a celebration. And look who he wants to celebrate with. The father celebrates with everybody on the farm. The brother, who does he want to celebrate with? His friends. His tight circle, his clique. There's a lot being said here that I really think the Pharisees and scribes are understanding. So why is he mad? Because his place in the family is based on what he has done. It's based on his works. He wasn't serving his father all those years out of love. He was serving his father all those years out of what he was going to get out of his father. I mean, how would he know? What would he do? He talks to his dad and says his brother spent all the money on wild living and on prostitutes. And I mean, he's calling him out very specifically. But did he talk to it? We don't have any record of him talking to his brother. He wouldn't have known that. So maybe that's what he would have done with the money had he had it like the younger brother, projecting much. That might give us a little insight into the mind of the older brother. And when he says slaughter, you slaughtered the fattened calf, it's also a familiar term that Jesus used in the world of sacrifice. So he's like, you sacrificed the fattened calf for your son, not my brother, your son. He can't even bring himself to say my brother. He said, your son. So for the Pharisees and scribes to think that somebody unrighteous and sinful had a sacrifice made for them, but not them, probably getting pretty steamed about right now. Let's look at verse 31. And he said to him, the father talking to the older son, Son, you have always been with me, and all that is mine is yours. But we had to celebrate and rejoice because this brother of yours was dead and has begun to live and was lost and has been found. There's a great difference in tone here. Whereas the older brother said never twice, and he was just negative about it, the father says always. And where the older brother says, your son, the father says, your brother. He's putting the relationship back into the equation. This is just beautiful. And so, what happens next? Well, that's the end of the story. And Jesus, as the master storyteller, I believe, is saying, Pharisees and scribes, you get to choose the end of the story. What are they going to do? It's interesting, remember I talked about Pharisees enforcing the 613 commandments and 613 commands, and the scribes copying down meticulously the first 5 books of Torah. Well, there are a tremendous number of connections and allusions that Jesus uses as the genius storyteller from Genesis, which they would have been intimately familiar with in this story. And I won't list them all. There are literally so many. But Cain and Abel, how about that? Illustration of Cain and Abel. You have a younger brother, older brother. You have one brother who worked in the fields, one brother who worked with animals. One was accepted, one was not. You have that dynamic going. How about Abraham, Isaac, and Ishmael? A father with 2 sons. Younger son gets the blessing. Older son does not. Bitterness. How about Jacob and Laban working for somebody for nothing? and Laban changed his wages several times. Or how about Jacob and Esau? That's an interesting one. Not the early Jacob and Esau, but the late Jacob and Esau, when Jacob came back to be reunited with Esau. Esau had been cheated out of everything by Jacob, and he forgave him. Uh-oh. Were the Pharisees making that connection that they weren't willing to forgive when Esau did? And also, there are two sequences in Scripture that follow this path, where you have somebody running and then embracing and then kissing. Big old bear hug, running, embracing, big old bear hug, and kissing. One is in the story here that we just read in Luke 15. The other is in Genesis when Esau did that with Jacob. Only two places in Scripture. I promise you that didn't go unnoticed. One more. How about Joseph? There's a famine in a faraway land. The younger son who's preferred gets the robe. Father who thinks his son is dead. There's a lot of connections. Jesus doesn't tell stories by accident. I think they're really getting the message. Well, how are the Pharisees going to relate to God? It's their call. I mean, they can relate to God through works, thinking they can earn their position in the kingdom, thinking they can earn their way to salvation, or they can take the younger brother's route and fall at the feet of Jesus and say, I am unworthy, save me. Nothing I've done can merit my place in your kingdom. So really, this story, to me, should be called the parable of the prodigal sons, because both sons are lost in this story at some point, and only one of the sons comes into right relationship with God, the Father, by the end of this story, and it's not the older brother. I mean, you have a choice on how this morning you can relate to God. You can relate to God like the younger brother and realize that there's nothing you can do to earn your way to heaven. Or you can think that the things you do somehow buys you a spot. Let me put it to you this way. You can come into this room every Sunday for worship in that pew. You can go to life group every week. You can give money to the church. You can even serve somewhere in the church, but if you think that any of those things is what gets you a spot in heaven and earns your salvation, you are just as lost as the person who's running 90 miles an hour away from God in open rebellion. It's not about what you do to earn your spot. It's about what Jesus Christ did on the cross, his death, burial, and resurrection, and victory over sin, so that you can put your faith and trust in him. That is what puts you in right relationship with God. Let's pray.